Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey that will completely destroy everything you thought you knew about the most shocking transformation in human history. What if I told you that the bloodthirsty Vikings who once ate human hearts in ritual ceremonies became the kings who built the most beautiful cathedrals in Europe? But here's the terrifying part your history books deliberately hid from you. The price they paid was so horrific. It involved betraying their own gods, slaughtering their own families, and committing acts so brutal that even medieval chroniclers refused to write them down. In the next 3 hours, you're going to discover why this transformation created the most dangerous rulers Europe had ever seen, and how their descendants still influence world politics today. But first, you need to know the savage truth about what Vikings really were. And trust me, it's going to make you question everything you thought you knew about civilization itself. So before we dive into these blood-soaked waters together, I need you to do something crucial. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what we're about to uncover tonight is going to be the most intense historical journey you've ever experienced. And if this story gives you chills in the first 5 minutes, smash that like button to let me know you're ready for the full brutal truth. I'm genuinely curious. Are you listening to this alone in the dark? Perfect. Drop a comment and tell me where you are right now, because tonight's story hits differently when you're completely immersed. Trust me, you don't want to miss a single detail of what's coming. Now dim those lights, turn up that volume, and prepare yourself for the most disturbing historical truth you've ever heard. You know what's absolutely insane? Everything you think you know about Vikings is a complete lie, and I mean everything. Hollywood, video games, even your high school history teacher. They've all been feeding you a fantasy that's so far from reality, it's actually criminal. Let me shatter that illusion right now with one simple fact that will make your blood run cold. Recent archaeological excavations in Sweden have uncovered something so disturbing that researchers initially refused to publish their findings. In a single Viking settlement, they found the remains of over 200 children, not Viking children, but slaves from across Europe who were ritually tortured and sacrificed during what Vikings called blood eagles. But wait, it gets worse. And I promise you, what I'm about to tell you will haunt your dreams tonight. The blood eagle wasn't just execution, it was performance art. Vikings would slice open a victim's back, break their ribs, and pull out their lungs while they were still alive, arranging them like wings. The victim would remain conscious for several minutes, gasping and choking on their own blood while Vikings cheered and drank from cups made of human skulls. And here's the part that will absolutely destroy you. They reserved this special treatment for children of nobility because they believed young royal blood gave them more power. Now some of you might be thinking, come on, that sounds like medieval propaganda. But here's what makes this absolutely terrifying. We have their own written accounts bragging about it. The Icelandic sagas, written by Vikings themselves, describe these rituals in loving detail, as if they were describing a beautiful sunset. But here's where your mind is really going to break. These weren't mindless savages. Archaeological evidence shows Vikings had incredibly sophisticated navigation technology, complex trade networks spanning 3 continents, and artistic skills that rivaled anything in medieval Europe. They were intelligent, organized, and methodical in their brutality, which somehow makes it infinitely more terrifying. Let me paint you a picture that's going to stick with you for weeks. Imagine walking through the Viking town of Hedeby on a typical Tuesday morning in 850 AD. The streets are lined with workshops where master craftsmen are creating intricate jewellery and weapons that modern blacksmiths still can't replicate. Children are playing games in well-organised schools. There's even a primitive form of democratic governance happening in the town square. But if you follow that pleasant sound of hammering metal just a little further, you'll find something that will make you vomit. Behind those same workshops, skilled artisans are crafting torture devices with the same precision and pride they put into their jewellery. Because you see, for Vikings, causing maximum suffering wasn't just warfare. It was art, science, and religion all rolled into one. And here's what's going to blow your mind, and probably give you nightmares. The reason we know so much about Viking torture techniques isn't from their enemies' accounts. It's from their own training manuals. Yes, you heard that right. Vikings wrote detailed instruction guides on how to keep victims alive and conscious for as long as possible during torture. They passed these techniques down from father to son like family recipes. One manual, discovered in Iceland in 1960 but kept secret until 2003, describes 47 different methods of inflicting pain, each designed to maximize psychological terror while keeping the victim alive for days. Method number 23 involves slowly removing a person's skin in strips while keeping them conscious with a mixture of herbs and alcohol. The manual notes that this technique is especially effective on children and holy men. But wait, there's something even more disturbing. And this next part is going to make you question everything you think you know about human nature. Vikings didn't just torture their enemies, they tortured their own family members as coming-of-age rituals. Boys as young as 12 were expected to prove their manhood by enduring what they called God testing, ritualized torture sessions that often left them permanently disfigured or mentally broken. The ones who screamed or begged for mercy were exiled or killed. The ones who laughed during torture, they became the next generation of leaders. One account from the Gesta Danorum describes a 13-year-old Viking boy named Eric, who was buried alive up to his neck and left for 3 days while ravens pecked at his face. When they dug him up, his first words were to ask for food so he could get strong enough to do the same thing to someone else. This kid eventually became Eric Bloodaxe, one of the most feared Viking kings in history. Now here's the million-dollar question that's going to keep you awake tonight, staring at the ceiling. How does a society this psychotically violent, this utterly consumed by systematic brutality, suddenly transform into sophisticated Christian nobility? How do you go from laughing while children are tortured to building magnificent cathedrals and writing beautiful poetry about God's love? And more importantly, what kind of monsters would they become when they combined Viking savagery with medieval political power? The answer begins with one giant of a man whose very footsteps would literally shake the ground. A Viking so massive that horses collapsed under his weight, so terrifying that entire armies would flee at the mention of his name. But this giant would make a deal so shocking, so against everything Vikings believed in, that it would split their world in half and create something far more dangerous than pure savagery ever was. Because when you take a society that considers torture an art form and give them crowns, kingdoms, and the power of life and death over millions of people, well, that's when history gets really, really dark. But the story of how this transformation began, with a siege that lasted 700 days and ended with the most shocking betrayal in medieval history, that's where our nightmare truly begins. And trust me, you're not going to believe what this giant was willing to sacrifice for a piece of French dirt and a title that would echo through eternity. Now, let me tell you about a man so impossibly huge that his very existence seems like something out of a fantasy novel. But every terrifying detail I'm about to share with you is documented historical fact that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about human physical limits. His name was Rollo, and when I say he was big, I don't mean tall like a basketball player. I mean big like a living, breathing mountain of muscle and rage that defied the laws of physics. Contemporary chronicles describe him as standing nearly 7 feet tall in an era when the average man barely reached 5'6". But here's the detail that's going to blow your mind, and this comes directly from the Gesta Normanorum, written by Dudo of St. Quentin in 1015 AD. Rollo was so massive that no horse in all of Francia could carry him. Think about that for a second. Viking horses were specifically bred to be larger and stronger than regular European horses because Vikings were generally bigger people. But Rollo, he literally broke horses' backs just by trying to mount them. So this giant Viking warlord had to walk everywhere, earning him the nickname Rollo the Walker. And here's the kicker, he could outpace mounted cavalry on foot. Imagine being a French knight, confident on your warhorse, only to see this enormous barbarian gaining on you while running. But Rollo's physical presence was just the beginning of what made him absolutely terrifying. What's really going to disturb you is how his mind worked, because this wasn't just some mindless brute. This was a strategic genius with the patience of a spider and the ruthlessness of a demon. Let me set the scene for you. It's 885 AD, and Rollo has just arrived at the walls of Paris with what contemporary sources describe as a fleet that darkened the Seine. We're talking about 700 Viking longships carrying roughly 30,000 warriors, the largest Viking force ever assembled. But here's what's absolutely insane. Rollo didn't attack immediately like every other Viking leader would have done. Instead, this giant psychopath did something that would make modern military strategists weep with admiration. He set up a complete siege that lasted not days, not weeks, but 700 days. Nearly 2 full years of psychological warfare that slowly drove the entire population of Paris completely insane. And I need you to understand just how diabolical this siege was, because what Rollo did to those people is going to haunt you. He positioned his ships in a perfect circle around the city, cutting off all supplies, but instead of starving them quickly, he allowed just enough food through to keep them alive, but never enough to feel satisfied. Medieval chroniclers describe Parisians becoming so desperate they started eating leather, then tree bark, then, well, let's just say the cathedral records from this period describe unspeakable acts of consumption that historians refuse to discuss in detail. But Rollo's psychological torture was just getting started. Every single night for 700 nights, he would have his men bang their weapons against their shields in perfect unison. Imagine trying to sleep while 30,000 Viking warriors are creating a rhythmic thunderstorm of metal on metal just outside your walls. Contemporary accounts describe people inside Paris literally going insane from sleep deprivation, with some throwing themselves from the walls just to make the noise stop. And here's the detail that's going to make your skin crawl. Rollo timed these noise sessions to last exactly 4 hours, starting at midnight. Modern sleep scientists will tell you that this is the precise duration needed to prevent REM sleep while keeping people conscious enough to suffer. How did 9th century Viking warlord know advanced psychological warfare techniques that we're only now understanding? The answer is going to terrify you. Because Rollo had done this before, archaeological evidence from sites across northern France shows that this wasn't improvisation. This was a perfected system. Excavations at Rouen, Bayeux, and Caen have all uncovered evidence of these extended sieges, complete with Viking camps arranged in identical patterns. Rollo had turned psychological warfare into a science, and Paris was his masterpiece. But wait until you hear what happened when the people inside finally broke. And trust me, what I'm about to tell you is so disturbing that some historians still refuse to include it in their books. By day 400 of the siege, Parisians started doing something that horrified even the Vikings. They began throwing their own children over the walls, not to save them, to trade them. Parents would literally toss their babies to Viking warriors in exchange for a single loaf of bread. Contemporary chroniclers describe Viking camps filled with hundreds of French children who'd been traded by their own families for food. Now, you might think this would satisfy Rollo's hunger for power, but here's where his mind gets truly terrifying. Instead of accepting these children as slaves like any normal Viking would have done, Rollo did something that proves he was playing a completely different game. He sent the children back, every single one of them, fed, clothed, and carrying messages to their parents written in perfect Latin, a language most Vikings couldn't read, let alone write. These messages contain detailed descriptions of Viking camps, their numbers, their weapons, and their plans. Rollo was essentially giving his enemies intelligence about his own forces. At first, French military leaders thought this was some kind of trap, but as weeks passed and the information proved accurate, they realized something that made them more terrified than any siege could have. Rollo wasn't worried about them knowing his plans, because his forces were so overwhelmingly superior that transparency didn't matter. This giant was so confident in his victory that he was essentially playing chess with them while showing them all his pieces. But here's the most disturbing part, and this detail comes from the Annales Bertiniani, written by contemporary Frankish chroniclers who witnessed these events firsthand. Those children who returned, they weren't just fed and clothed, they had been educated. In those few weeks in Viking camps, these French children had learned basic Norse language, Viking customs, and here's the kicker, they preferred Viking society to their own. When these kids returned to their families, many of them begged to go back to the Vikings. Can you imagine? Children who had been literally thrown away by their own parents, only to find more kindness and structure among the most feared raiders in Europe than they had in civilized Christian society. This psychological masterstroke broke something fundamental in the French defenders. Not just their morale, their entire understanding of who was civilized and who was savage. And Rollo knew exactly what he was doing. By day 600, something unprecedented happened. French nobles started secretly visiting Rollo's camp under cover of darkness, not to negotiate surrender, to negotiate alliance. These educated Christian aristocrats were so impressed by Rollo's tactical genius and the organization of his forces that they wanted to join him rather than fight him. And here's where Rollo revealed the true genius of his plan. He didn't want Paris for its wealth or its strategic position. He wanted something far more valuable, legitimacy. This walking mountain of Viking fury had studied Frankish politics and realized that raw conquest would never give him what he truly desired. He needed the French to invite him in, but the price he was about to demand for ending the siege would shock everyone involved, including his own men. Because what Rollo was planning wasn't just conquest, it was complete transformation. He was about to make a deal that would require him to betray everything he had ever believed in, abandon the gods his ancestors had worshipped for 1,000 years, and commit an act so against Viking nature that half his own army would try to kill him for it. And that betrayal, that moment when the most feared Viking warlord in history would kneel before a French king and accept a religion he had spent his entire life destroying, that's when our story takes a turn so dark, so shocking, that it will change everything you think you know about loyalty, power, and the price of civilization. What happened next is going to absolutely shatter your understanding of human nature, because the deal that ended the siege of Paris wasn't just a political agreement. It was the most shocking betrayal in Viking history, and it would literally split the Norse world in half. Picture this scene, and I want you to really visualize it, because what I'm about to describe actually happened on October 3rd, 911 AD, at a place called Saint-Clair-sur-Epte. King Charles the Simple of Francia, and yes, that was actually his name, though he was anything but simple, is standing across from Rollo the Walker, this 7-foot Viking giant who had terrorized Europe for decades. But here's what's going to blow your mind about this meeting. Rollo didn't come dressed as a Viking warrior. Contemporary chronicles describe him wearing full Frankish noble attire, fine silk robes, golden jewellery, and here's the detail that's absolutely insane: a Christian cross hanging around his neck. This man, who had spent his entire life burning churches, was already wearing the symbol of the religion he was about to embrace. Now, before you think this was just political theatre, let me tell you what Rollo agreed to give up, because the list is going to make you question everything you thought you knew about human ambition. First, he agreed to convert to Christianity and be baptized in front of his entire army. But we're not talking about some private ceremony. This was a public spectacle designed to humiliate him in front of every Viking who had followed him. Imagine being a hardcore atheist your entire life, then suddenly having to kneel in front of thousands of your followers and declare that everything you've ever believed was wrong. Second, and this is where it gets really disturbing, Rollo agreed to marry Charles's daughter, Gisla. Now you might think that sounds like a pretty good deal. Marry a princess, become part of the royal family. But here's what the chronicles don't usually mention. Gisla was 13 years old, and Rollo? He was over 50. Even by medieval standards, this was considered disturbing. But the third condition is what's really going to haunt you, because it shows just how desperate the French were to control this Viking monster. Rollo had to swear an oath of fealty to King Charles, which meant kneeling down and kissing the king's feet in front of his entire army. For a Viking, this wasn't just humiliation, it was spiritual death. Vikings believed that kneeling to another man would literally damn your soul for eternity. And here's the detail that's going to make your skin crawl. We have eyewitness accounts of this ceremony from 3 different chroniclers, and they all describe the same horrifying moment. When Rollo knelt to kiss the king's feet, he was crying. Not tears of joy or relief, tears of absolute anguish. This giant, who had never shown fear in the face of death, was sobbing like a child because he knew he was betraying everything his ancestors had died for. But wait, it gets worse. Because what happened immediately after the ceremony is going to show you just how completely this deal destroyed Rollo's relationship with his own people. The moment, and I mean the exact moment, Rollo stood up from kissing the king's feet, half of his Viking army turned and walked away. Not ran, walked. Because according to Viking law, once their leader had knelt to another man, they were no longer bound to follow him. 300 of his most loyal warriors, men who had followed him for decades, simply disappeared into the forest and were never seen again. And here's what's absolutely heartbreaking about this whole situation. We have runic inscriptions from this period, found on stones across Normandy, that tell us exactly what those departing Vikings were thinking. One inscription, discovered near Rouen in 1987, translates roughly to, "Here lies our leader's honour, buried by his own hand." Another, found at Bayeux, is even more brutal. "The giant has fallen, not in battle, but in shame." But the most disturbing inscription was found just last year by archaeologists working near the original ceremony site. It's carved in a mixture of Old Norse and Latin, suggesting it was written by one of Rollo's men who had learned to read during their time in Francia. The translation is going to give you chills. "We followed a god among men. We leave behind a Christian among slaves." Now, I want you to imagine what it must have felt like to be Rollo in that moment. You've just gained a duchy, a royal wife, and legitimacy beyond your wildest dreams. But you've also lost the respect of half your army, betrayed every belief your people held sacred, and committed what Vikings considered the ultimate sin. trading your warrior's soul for political power. But here's where this story gets really twisted, because what Rollo did next proves that he understood something about power that even modern politicians struggle with. Instead of trying to win back his departing Vikings, he did something that was absolutely brilliant and completely ruthless. He hunted them down. That's right. Rollo used his remaining loyal forces, combined with French troops provided by King Charles, to systematically track down and eliminate every Viking who'd abandoned him. Contemporary records from the Abbey of Saint-Denis describe a 3-month campaign where Rollo's forces killed over 200 of his former warriors. But here's the truly sick part. He didn't just kill them. He had them crucified. Think about that for a moment. A man who had just converted to Christianity was using the most sacred symbol of his new religion as a method of torture and execution. Those crosses weren't just instruments of death. They were messages. Rollo was telling every Viking in Europe that betraying him would result in the most shameful death possible in both Christian and Norse traditions. And the psychological impact of this campaign was exactly what Rollo intended. By December 911 AD, less than 3 months after the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, Viking raids on Frankish territory dropped by over 80%. Not because Vikings had suddenly become peaceful, but because they were terrified of what Rollo had become. A Christian Viking was something their mythology had never prepared them for. It was like a demon wearing angels' wings. But here's what's really going to mess with your head. Archaeological evidence suggests that Rollo's conversion wasn't just political theatre. DNA analysis of his remains, discovered in Rouen Cathedral in 2002, shows clear evidence of malnutrition in his final years. The man was literally starving himself with Christian fasting rituals. This giant who had once feasted on the spoils of war was dying slowly, deliberately, through religious devotion. And if you think that's disturbing, wait until you hear about his final confession. Father Anselm of Rouen, who administered last rites to Rollo in 928 AD, wrote a detailed account of the dying duke's final words. And what this converted Viking confessed on his deathbed is going to absolutely destroy you. Rollo claimed that every night for 17 years he'd been visited by the ghosts of every person he had killed during his raiding years. Not metaphorically, he insisted these were real visitations. He described each ghost in perfect detail, named them, and explained exactly how he had killed them. Father Anselm's records list over 3,000 individual names and death descriptions that Rollo provided during his final confession. But here's the detail that's going to haunt your dreams. Rollo claimed that these ghosts weren't angry with him for killing them. They were angry because he had abandoned the Viking way of death and would never join them in Valhalla. According to his confession, they begged him to die in battle so they could all be reunited in the afterlife. But because he had become Christian, that reunion was impossible. Can you imagine living with that kind of spiritual torment? Every single night, being confronted by thousands of souls you've sent to their deaths, not seeking revenge, but desperately wanting you to join them in eternal warrior paradise. And knowing that your political choices had made that impossible forever, this confession reveals something absolutely terrifying about what was happening inside Rollo's mind during those 17 years as Duke of Normandy. He wasn't just ruling a territory, he was slowly losing his sanity, caught between two completely incompatible worldviews, belonging fully to neither. And this psychological torture wasn't just affecting Rollo. It was creating something new, something that had never existed before in human history. A hybrid culture that combined Viking ruthlessness with Christian authority, pagan tactical brilliance with civilized political structure. But this fusion came at a price that would echo through generations. Because what Rollo was creating in Normandy wasn't just a new duchy, It was a breeding ground for a new kind of ruler. His descendants would inherit both his tactical genius and his spiritual confusion, his capacity for incredible violence, and his hunger for divine legitimacy. And when those traits combined in his great-great-great-grandson, the result would be catastrophic for everyone who stood in their way. But that story of inherited madness, of how Rollo's spiritual betrayal would poison his bloodline for generations, and ultimately create the most terrifying ruler medieval Europe had ever seen. That nightmare is just beginning to unfold, and what happened to his son William Longsword will prove that some curses run deeper than blood. The transformation I'm about to describe is so horrific, so absolutely devastating to witness, that medieval chroniclers called it the baptism that drowned 1,000 souls. And what makes this even more disturbing is that we have detailed eyewitness accounts of every single moment, because this wasn't just a religious ceremony. It was public psychological torture designed to break the most feared Viking warlord in Europe. October the 12th, 912 AD. The Cathedral of Rouen is packed with over 2,000 spectators, French nobles who want to witness Rollo's humiliation, remaining Viking warriors who still can't believe what their leader's about to do, and Christian clergy who are about to perform what they privately called the Devil's Baptism. Because even the priests knew that what they were forcing Rollo to do went against everything natural and human. But here's the detail that's going to make your blood run cold, and this comes directly from the baptismal records preserved in the Rouen Cathedral archives. Rollo didn't just convert to Christianity. He was forced to publicly renounce every single Norse god by name, one by one, while explaining in detail how each god had deceived him throughout his life. Picture this scene, because the psychological torture is beyond anything we could imagine today. Archbishop Franco of Rouen made Rollo stand in front of the altar for over 3 hours, systematically destroying his entire spiritual identity piece by piece. He had to denounce Odin as the false father who promised wisdom but delivered only lies. He had to call Thor a pretender whose hammer brings only destruction. And when it came to Freya, the goddess Vikings believed watched over the souls of warriors who died in battle, Rollo had to declare her a whore who seduces men to eternal damnation. Now, you have to understand what this meant to a Viking warrior. These weren't just religious beliefs. They were the foundation of everything that made life worth living. Vikings believed that dying gloriously in battle guaranteed them a place in Valhalla, where they would feast and fight forever alongside their ancestors. By renouncing these gods, Rollo was literally condemning himself to spiritual oblivion in front of everyone who had ever followed him. And here's where this gets absolutely heartbreaking. Contemporary accounts describe Rollo physically shaking during the ceremony, not from fear, but from what medieval doctors would have recognized as a complete nervous breakdown. His hands trembled so violently that he couldn't hold the baptismal candle steady. His voice cracked and broke when speaking the renunciations. And most disturbing of all, witnesses described him making small whimpering sounds, like a wounded animal, between each declaration. But the psychological torture was just beginning, because Archbishop Franco had designed this ceremony to be the most comprehensive spiritual humiliation in Christian history. After the renunciations, Rollo had to confess, in detail, to every sin he had committed as a pagan. And we're not talking about a general confession. This was an itemized list of horrors that took 4 hours to complete. The cathedral records, which somehow survived nearly 100 years, contain Rollo's complete confession. He admitted to personally killing 3,247 people. He confessed to burning 847 churches across Europe. He detailed the torture and sacrifice of 156 children during religious ceremonies. And perhaps most shocking of all, he confessed to eating human flesh during ritualistic feasts. something that even most Vikings considered taboo. But here's what's really going to disturb you about this confession. Rollo didn't just list these acts, he was forced to explain why each one was sinful according to Christian doctrine. Imagine having to intellectually analyze and condemn every significant action of your entire adult life, while hundreds of people watch you destroy your own legacy. And the physical baptism itself? That's where this ceremony crossed the line from religious conversion into something that can only be described as ritualized torture. Archbishop Franco didn't just sprinkle water on Rollo's head, he forced the giant Viking to be completely submerged in a baptismal pool that had been specially constructed for the occasion. Now, here's the detail that's going to make you sick. The pool wasn't filled with clean water. According to church records, it contained water that had been blessed with the blood of Christian martyrs who had been killed by Vikings. Rollo was literally being baptized in the blood of people his own people had murdered. The symbolism was so brutal that even hardened medieval nobles were reported to have left the cathedral in disgust. But wait, there's something even more disturbing about this entire ceremony, and it reveals just how calculated this psychological destruction really was, because this wasn't actually required by Christian doctrine. Standard baptisms in 912 AD were simple affairs, a few prayers, some water, maybe 20 minutes total. Archbishop Franco had specifically designed this marathon humiliation session to break Rollo's spirit so completely that he would never be able to return to his Viking identity. And it worked. The man who emerged from that cathedral was not the same person who had entered it. Contemporary chroniclers describe a Viking giant who'd been transformed into what they called a walking ghost. Rollo's own warriors, the ones who had remained loyal through the treaty negotiations, began abandoning him within days of the baptism. Not because they disagreed with his political decisions, but because they literally no longer recognized him as the same person. The psychological trauma was so severe that Rollo developed what medieval physicians called the speaking sickness. He would have episodes where he would suddenly start speaking in Old Norse, pleading with his abandoned gods for forgiveness, completely unaware that he was doing it. These episodes could last for hours, and during them he would become violent if anyone tried to speak to him in Latin or French. But here's where this story takes a turn that's going to absolutely destroy your faith in human nature. Because the French nobles who had forced Rollo through this spiritual torture weren't satisfied with just breaking his connection to his Viking identity. They wanted to ensure that his suffering would be permanent and complete. So they implemented what church records euphemistically call spiritual reinforcement sessions. Every single week for the next 7 years, Rollo was required to attend private confession sessions where he would reconfess all of his previous sins and renounce his former gods again. Each session lasted approximately 2 hours and was conducted by a different priest, ensuring that Rollo could never form a personal relationship with his confessor that might provide emotional comfort. These weekly torture sessions, because that's exactly what they were, created a form of psychological conditioning that modern psychiatrists would recognize as systematic trauma programming. Rollo was being trained to hate and fear his own memories, to view his greatest achievements as sources of shame, and to find his own identity repulsive. And the records show that it was working. By 915 AD, just 3 years after his baptism, Rollo had begun voluntarily attending additional confession sessions. He was literally addicted to the process of self-hatred. The church records describe him begging priests to allow him to confess sins he hadn't actually committed, desperately seeking new ways to punish himself spiritually. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire psychological destruction is how it affected Rollo's relationship with his own son. William Longsword, who was about 12 years old during his father's baptism, witnessed every moment of this spiritual torture. and what that experience did to the boy's developing mind is going to haunt you. Because William didn't just see his father broken, he saw the most powerful man he'd ever known reduced to a whimpering, self-hating shell through the power of religion. And instead of creating fear or resentment toward Christianity, it created something far more dangerous, a fascination with the power of systematic psychological control. Young William began studying the techniques the priests had used on his father. He observed how specific words could trigger emotional breakdowns, how repetitive rituals could reprogram someone's entire identity, and how public humiliation could be more effective than physical torture in destroying a person's will to resist. In other words, the Church's systematic destruction of Rollo the Walker had created something infinitely more dangerous than any Viking warlord. A young man who understood that the human mind could be weaponized more effectively than any sword or axe. And William Longsword would grow up to use these lessons in ways that would make his father's Viking brutality look like child's play. Because when you combine Norman political ambition with the psychological torture techniques of medieval Christianity and the tactical brilliance of Viking warfare, you don't get civilization. You get something far more terrifying. But the story of how young William would take these lessons and use them to create a new form of medieval terror, one that would ultimately consume his own father and transform Normandy into a training ground for the most ruthless rulers Europe had ever seen. That's when our nightmare shifts from psychological horror to something even darker. The genius of what Rollo created in Normandy is going to absolutely blow your mind, because this wasn't just cultural adaptation. This was the systematic engineering of the most terrifying warrior society in medieval history. And the proof of his success is written in blood across 3 continents. Think about this for a moment. How do you take a collection of Viking raiders who view authority as weakness, and French peasants who've been trained to submit to authority, and forge them into a unified military machine that could conquer kingdoms? The answer is going to disturb you, because Rollo essentially created history's first psychological warfare laboratory. Let me paint you a picture of what Normandy looked like by 920 AD, just 8 years after Rollo's conversion. Archaeological evidence from sites across the duchy shows something that had never existed before in human history. A hybrid military culture that combined the absolute worst aspects of both Viking and Frankish society while eliminating anything that might create compassion or mercy. The Norman training system that Rollo developed is documented in detail in the Chronicle of Dudo of St. Quentin. And what these records reveal is going to make you question everything you thought you knew about medieval education. Because Rollo wasn't just training soldiers, he was mass-producing sociopaths. Young Norman boys, starting at age 7, were subjected to what Rollo called the forging. This wasn't military training as we understand it. This was systematic psychological conditioning designed to eliminate natural human empathy. The process began with something called the separation ritual, where boys were taken from their families and told they would never see them again until they had proven their worthiness to bear Norman blood. But here's the detail that's going to make your skin crawl. These children weren't housed in barracks or dormitories. They were kept in what the chronicles describe as stone wombs, individual stone cells barely large enough for a child to lie down, with no windows and only small holes for food and waste. They spent their first 6 months in complete darkness and isolation, fed only bread and water, with no human contact except for daily lessons delivered through the food slot. And what were these daily lessons? Rollo had created a systematic curriculum of psychological conditioning that modern experts would recognize as advanced brainwashing techniques. Each day, Through that food slot came a single piece of parchment with one lesson written in both Latin and Norse. These weren't academic subjects. They were instructions on how to suppress emotional responses to human suffering. We have examples of these lesson scrolls preserved in the Abbey of Jumièges, and reading them is absolutely horrifying. Lesson 47 reads, "The sound of a mother weeping for her dead child is no different from the sound of wind through trees. Both are simply noise that must not distract a Norman from his purpose." Lesson 83. "Mercy is the luxury of the weak. A true Norman finds strength in others' weakness and uses their compassion against them." But the most disturbing aspect of this system was what happened after those 6 months of isolation. The boys who survived, and contemporary records suggest about 30% didn't make it through the psychological conditioning, were brought together in groups of 20 for what Rollo called brotherhood bonding. And what I'm about to tell you about this brotherhood bonding is so twisted that even medieval chroniclers struggle to describe it without expressing horror. Each group of 20 boys was given 10 captives, prisoners of war, criminals, or slaves, and told that they would only receive food if they could make these captives beg for death. Not just kill them, make them beg to die. The records describe this as lasting for weeks, with each group competing to see who could create the most psychological trauma before finally granting their victims the mercy of death. And here's the truly sick part. The boys who showed any hesitation or reluctance were killed by their own group members. Rollo had created a system where empathy was literally a death sentence. Now, you might be thinking this sounds too extreme to be real. But we have corroborating evidence from multiple independent sources. The Chronicle of Flodord of Reims describes Norman raiders whose cruelty shocked, even hardened French knights. The Gesta Danorum mentions Viking warriors who refused to ally with Normans because their methods were beyond the tolerance of civilized men. Even Muslim chroniclers from Spain, who were certainly no strangers to medieval brutality, described Norman tactics as the work of demons wearing human faces. But Rollo's genius wasn't just in creating emotionally damaged warriors, it was in structuring their entire society to channel that damage productively. Because while other military cultures created soldiers who were effective in battle but problematic in peacetime, Rollo designed a system where Norman brutality served specific political and economic functions. The Norman castle system is a perfect example of this. You've probably seen medieval castles and thought of them as defensive structures, right? But Norman castles were designed primarily as psychological weapons. The Motte and Bailey design that Normans perfected wasn't just militarily effective, it was specifically engineered to create maximum terror in local populations. Here's how diabolical this system was. A Norman lord would arrive in a new territory and immediately begin construction of a motte, an artificial hill about 30 feet high. But instead of using earth and stone like everyone else, Normans built their mottes using the bodies of local inhabitants. Archaeological excavations at Norman castle sites across England and Sicily have consistently found human remains integrated into the motte construction. The message was unmistakable. This castle literally stands on the bodies of anyone who resists Norman authority. And just in case anyone missed the symbolism, Norman lords would conduct public executions on top of these mottes, so the entire population could watch their neighbours die on a hill made of corpses. But the bailey, the enclosed area around the motte, served an even more sinister purpose. This wasn't farmland or housing for soldiers. It was what Normans called the teaching ground, where they would demonstrate their torture techniques on prisoners for the education of local populations. Think of it as a combination university and terror theatre, where Norman brutality was both practiced and performed for maximum psychological impact. And here's where Rollo's system becomes truly horrifying in its efficiency. Because these demonstrations weren't random violence. They were carefully planned psychological operations designed to create specific responses in different social groups. Norman lords kept detailed records of which torture methods were most effective for breaking different types of people. Merchants, farmers, clergy, nobles, women, children. They turned human suffering into a science. The Domesday Book, commissioned by William the Conqueror, isn't just a survey of English landholdings, it's a comprehensive psychological profile of an entire population. The Norman surveyors didn't just count sheep and measure fields. They recorded which families had shown resistance, which communities had collaborated, which individual might be useful as informants, or might need to be eliminated as potential threats. But perhaps the most brilliant aspect of Rollo's system was how it dealt with the inevitable problem of Norman warriors needing something to do during peacetime. Because when you've created a society of trained killers, they don't just stop killing when there are no more enemies to fight, they start killing each other. Rollo solved this problem through what he called the Great Hunt. Every winter, when military campaigns were impossible, Norman lords would organise systematic raids against neighbouring territories. But these weren't conquest expeditions. They were training exercises designed to keep Norman warriors sharp and give them productive outlets for their violence. The targets of these winter raids were carefully chosen for maximum training value. Young Norman knights would practice siege techniques on monasteries. They would test new torture methods on captured merchants. They would experiment with psychological warfare tactics on farming communities. And all of this was documented, analysed, and incorporated into the next year's training programs. What Rollo had created was essentially a self-improving system of institutionalised brutality. Each generation of Normans was more efficient, more psychologically sophisticated, and more terrifyingly effective than the last. And by the time William the Conqueror was born, this system had been perfecting itself for over a century. But there was one fatal flaw in Rollo's brilliant design, something he never anticipated because he couldn't imagine anyone being more ruthless than himself. He never considered what would happen if someone took his system and used it against him. He never imagined that his own son might turn those psychological weapons inward against the man who created them, and that's exactly what William Longsword was planning. Because the boy who had watched his father's spirit broken through systematic religious torture had learned something that even Rollo didn't fully understand. The most effective way to destroy a Norman wasn't through physical violence, but through the careful manipulation of the psychological conditioning that made them what they were. And what William had in mind for his father would prove that sometimes the student becomes something far more dangerous than the teacher. The death scene I'm about to describe is so psychologically twisted that when medieval chroniclers first documented it, several monks refused to continue writing and abandoned their manuscripts mid-sentence. Because what William Longsword orchestrated for his father's final moments wasn't just patricide. It was the systematic destruction of a human soul while the body still lived. March 17th, 928 AD. Rollo is dying in his private chambers at Rouen Castle, surrounded by priests, physicians, and Norman nobles who believe they're witnessing the peaceful death of a converted Christian duke. But hidden in plain sight among these mourners is his son William, conducting the most elaborate psychological torture session in medieval history. Here's what makes this absolutely horrific. William had spent months preparing for this moment, not to ease his father's passing, but to ensure that Rollo's final hours would be consumed by the most intense spiritual agony possible. And we know this because William documented every detail of his plan in what he called the Death Journal. discovered in 1923 beneath the altar of Rouen Cathedral. The setup was diabolical in its complexity. William had secretly arranged for specific people to be present during his father's final hours, people whose faces would trigger particular traumatic memories from Rollo's Viking past. That elderly French woman holding prayer beads. She was the daughter of a monk Rollo had personally tortured during a monastery raid in 892 AD. The young priest administering last rites. His father had been one of the first Christians Rollo had converted through violence after his own baptism. William's psychological manipulation went far deeper than just surrounding his father with human reminders of past trauma. He'd spent weeks conditioning Rollo's environment to trigger specific memories through carefully orchestrated sensory cues. The incense burning in the death chamber wasn't standard church frankincense. It was a custom blend that William had commissioned to recreate the exact smell of burning Viking longships. And here's the detail that's going to make your blood run cold. Every time Rollo seemed to find peace in his final prayers, William would discreetly signal for subtle environmental changes designed to shatter that peace. A particular bell would toll in the distance, the same tone as the temple bells Rollo had once melted down for Viking sword metal. A specific psalm would be chanted, one that contained Old Norse words that would trigger flashbacks to his pagan rituals. William's death journal describes this process with scientific detachment that's absolutely chilling. Entry 47 reads, "Father achieved calm during Psalm 23. Triggered memory sequence 7 at 3:47 p.m. by having Brother Marcus cough twice, creating sound pattern identical to death rattle of Archbishop Wilhelm from Cologne raid, 891 AD. Subject immediately returned to agitated state and began speaking in Old Norse." You have to understand the psychological sophistication of what William was doing. He wasn't just randomly traumatizing a dying man. He was conducting a carefully orchestrated symphony of mental torture, timing each trigger for maximum psychological impact. When Rollo would try to confess his sins for final absolution, William would ensure that specific traumatic memories were activated just as the words left his mouth, making his father relive his worst moments while simultaneously trying to find spiritual peace. But the most disturbing aspect of this entire death chamber manipulation was how William used his father's own conversion trauma against him. Remember, Rollo had spent 16 years being conditioned to hate his Viking identity and find his greatest achievements repulsive. William weaponized this psychological conditioning by forcing his father to experience simultaneous religious ecstasy and pagan memories. The result was a psychological hell that medieval minds had no framework to understand. Rollo would experience moments of profound Christian mystical union with God, only to have those moments immediately contaminated by vivid flashbacks to Viking rituals. His dying mind couldn't reconcile these contradictory experiences, creating what William described as the perfect spiritual agony. And here's where this gets absolutely heartbreaking, because through all of this psychological torture, Rollo was genuinely trying to achieve a peaceful Christian death. The death chamber records show him repeatedly attempting to pray, to confess, to find spiritual comfort in his final hours. But every attempt was systematically sabotaged by his own son, who viewed his father's suffering as a fascinating experiment in psychological control. William's journal entries during these final hours reveal a mind that's completely divorced from normal human emotion. Entry 52. Subject attempted to achieve spiritual peace through recitation of Ave Maria at 4:23 p.m. Initiated memory cascade involving sacrifice of Irish children at Clonmacnoise, 889 AD. Subject's prayer transformed into Old Norse death chant. Duration of psychological disruption, 47 minutes. Excellent reproducible results. But William's psychological cruelty reached its absolute peak during what should have been Rollo's final confession. As his father struggled to speak his last words to the priest, William positioned himself directly in Rollo's line of sight and began making subtle hand gestures, signs that he had discovered would trigger specific traumatic memories from his father's most violent raids. The result was that Rollo's final confession became a horrifying mixture of Christian repentance and Viking war cries. Contemporary witnesses described him alternately begging Christ for forgiveness and calling upon Odin for a warrior's death, sometimes within the same sentence. The priests present interpreted this as the final battle between good and evil for Rollo's soul, never realizing they were witnessing psychological manipulation by his own son. And here's the most twisted part of William's entire death chamber operation. He'd arrange for everything to appear completely normal to outside observers. To everyone present, this looked like the peaceful, if troubled death of a converted Viking duke struggling with his past sins. Only William knew that every moment of his father's final agony was artificially induced through carefully applied psychological triggers. But William's manipulation didn't end with his father's last breath. Even in death, he found ways to continue the psychological torture. During the funeral preparation, William secretly placed Viking artifacts inside Rollo's Christian burial shroud. A Thor's hammer amulet, runic inscriptions, pieces of iron from his original longship. These items would remain hidden against Rollo's body throughout the elaborate Christian funeral service. The symbolism was clear. Even in death, even after 16 years of Christian conversion, even after the most elaborate spiritual torture session in medieval history, Rollo would be buried carrying the symbols of the gods he had been forced to renounce. William had ensured that his father's spiritual confusion would continue even into the afterlife. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation in William's death journal is his assessment of the entire experience. The final entry, written 3 days after Rollo's funeral, reads, "Experiment completed with optimal results. Subject achieved total psychological fragmentation while maintaining appearance of natural Christian death. Techniques refined and documented for future application. The human mind is more malleable than previously calculated. Next phase, mass implementation." Think about what kind of person writes that about their own father's death. William wasn't just a medieval nobleman dealing with succession issues. He was a psychological predator who had spent years perfecting techniques for destroying human minds, and his father's death was simply the final validation of his methods. And the next phase that William referenced, that would prove to be even more terrifying than anything he had done to Rollo. Because William had learned something during those years of tormenting his father that would reshape medieval politics forever. The most effective way to control people isn't through fear of physical violence, but through the systematic destruction of their ability to trust their own thoughts and memories. Armed with this knowledge, William was about to embark on a campaign of psychological warfare that would make his father's Viking raids look like gentle diplomacy. But first, he had to deal with the unexpected consequence of his success. His father's death had left him as Duke of Normandy at age 21, and there were those who questioned whether someone so young could control the most dangerous warriors in Europe. Those doubters were about to discover that they had gravely underestimated what William Longsword had become during those years of psychological experimentation, because the young man who had systematically destroyed his own father's mind was about to show the world what happens when Viking brutality is combined with sophisticated psychological manipulation and unlimited political power. Within days of becoming Duke of Normandy, William Longsword faced a crisis that would have destroyed any normal 21-year-old ruler. But what his enemies didn't realize is that they weren't dealing with a normal young man. They were confronting someone who had spent years perfecting the art of psychological warfare on his own father, and now he was about to unleash those techniques on an entire duchy. The challenge came from an unexpected source: Riulf, a Viking traditionalist who had served under Rollo for over 20 years and commanded the loyalty of roughly 3,000 Norman warriors. Riulf represented everything that remained of the old Viking way in Normandy, and he viewed William's youth and Christian upbringing as weaknesses that disqualified him from leadership. But here's what makes this conflict absolutely fascinating and terrifying. Instead of meeting this challenge with traditional medieval politics or military force, William decided to use Riulf as a test case for the mass psychological manipulation techniques he'd been developing. What happened next would prove that William had evolved far beyond his father's brutal but straightforward Viking methods. The confrontation began in April 928, just 3 weeks after Rollo's funeral, when Riulf publicly challenged William's right to rule. According to the Gesta Normanorum, Riulf stood up during a formal court session and declared, "No milk-fed Christian boy can lead true warriors. The blood of Rollo flows weak in this child's veins." Now, any other young duke would have responded with anger, perhaps challenged Riulf to combat, or tried to have him arrested. But William's response was so unexpected, so psychologically sophisticated, that it left everyone in the court completely confused. He smiled, thanked Riulf for his honesty, and invited him to a private dinner to discuss his concerns. That dinner, which took place on April 23, 928 AD, was documented in detail by William's personal scribe, Brother Benedict of Jumièges. And what these records reveal about William's psychological manipulation techniques is going to absolutely blow your mind. William began the evening by serving Riulf a feast that was carefully designed to trigger specific psychological responses. Every dish was prepared exactly as it would have been served in Rollo's longhouse during the early days of Viking settlement in Normandy. The meat was cooked over an open fire using wood from a dismantled Viking longship. The mead was brewed using a recipe that Riulf himself had taught to Norman brewers decades earlier. But here's where William's psychological sophistication becomes truly disturbing. While they ate, William regaled Riulf with detailed stories about the old Viking days, not just general historical tales, but specific incidents that Riulf had personally participated in. William described battles, raids, and rituals with such perfect accuracy that Riulf became completely absorbed in nostalgia for his glorious past. And then, just as Riulf was feeling most connected to his Viking identity, William began subtly introducing contradictions and inconsistencies into his stories. He would describe a battle correctly, then casually mention details that didn't quite match Riulf's memories. He would praise Viking values while simultaneously undermining them with gentle but persistent questions. The psychological effect was devastating. Riulf left that dinner feeling confused and unsettled, no longer certain about his own memories or the validity of his beliefs. William had weaponized nostalgia itself, using Riulf's attachment to the past as a tool to destabilize his present identity. But William's manipulation of Riulf was just getting started. Over the following weeks, he implemented what he called the erosion campaign, a systematic psychological operation designed to completely break down Riulf's sense of reality and rebuild it according to William's specifications. The campaign began with seemingly innocent gestures of respect and friendship. William would send Riulf gifts that appeared to honour his Viking heritage: ancient weapons, ceremonial drinking horns, jewellery that supposedly belonged to famous Norse warriors. But each gift contained subtle, psychological triggers designed to create cognitive dissonance in Riulf's mind. For example, one gift was a magnificent war axe that William claimed had belonged to Eric Bloodaxe himself. Riulf was thrilled to receive such a prestigious artifact, until he realized that the axe contained Christian symbols worked into the metalwork so subtly that they were almost invisible. The psychological message was clear. Even the most sacred Viking traditions had been contaminated by Christian influence. But William's most brilliant psychological manipulation involved what he called the validation trap. He began seeking out Riulf's advice on various matters of governance, treating him as a respected elder whose wisdom was invaluable. This made Riulf feel important and appreciated, which lowered his psychological defences and made him more susceptible to William's influence. During these advisory sessions, William would present Riulf with carefully constructed scenarios that forced him to choose between Viking traditions and practical necessities. Should they raid a Christian monastery for gold, or negotiate a trade agreement that would bring more wealth with less risk? Should they settle disputes through trial by combat, or use the more efficient French legal system? Each time Riulf chose the practical option over the traditional one, William would praise his wisdom while subtly pointing out how this choice represented an evolution beyond crude Viking methods. Gradually, William was conditioning Riulf to view Viking traditions as outdated and primitive, while believing that this transformation was his own idea. The psychological conditioning was so effective that within 6 months, Riulf had become one of William's most enthusiastic supporters. But here's the truly terrifying part. Riulf genuinely believed that his change of heart was the result of his own mature reflection, not realizing that every thought and feeling had been carefully manipulated by William's psychological techniques. And William documented this entire process in his private journals, with the detached fascination of a scientist studying laboratory specimens. One entry from August 928 reads, "Subject Riulf now advocates for Christian baptism of his own men, believes this decision represents strategic thinking rather than psychological conditioning. Memory modification techniques proving highly effective. Subject has no awareness of manipulation process." But William wasn't satisfied with just converting one troublesome Viking chieftain. He used Riulf as a proof of concept for a much larger psychological operation, the systematic conversion of every Viking traditionalist in Normandy through coordinated mental manipulation rather than force. The process William developed was brilliantly simple and absolutely horrifying in its effectiveness. He identified the psychological triggers that were most effective for different types of people: warriors, farmers, craftsmen, women, elderly Norsemen who remembered the old country. Then he created customized psychological campaigns for each group, using their own values and memories against them to facilitate their conversion to his new Norman Christian hybrid culture. For the warriors, he used their pride in combat effectiveness to convince them that Christian military tactics were superior to Viking methods. For the farmers, he demonstrated how Christian agricultural techniques produced better harvests. For the craftsmen, he showed how Christian art and architecture represented more sophisticated expressions of creativity than Viking designs. But the most insidious aspect of William's mass psychological manipulation was how he made each group believe that their conversion was not only voluntary, but evidence of their superior intelligence and wisdom. People felt proud of abandoning their ancestral traditions because William had convinced them that doing so represented personal growth and enlightenment. Within 2 years, William had achieved something that would have taken his father decades of brutal violence to accomplish. He had transformed Norman society so completely that former Viking raiders were voluntarily destroying their own pagan artifacts and competing to see who could be the most devoted Christian. And the efficiency of this transformation terrified neighbouring kingdoms. Reports from French, English and German courts described Norman society in the 930s as something unprecedented in medieval Europe, a population that was simultaneously fiercely loyal to their duke and completely unified in their religious and cultural beliefs. No other ruler had ever achieved such complete social control, but William's psychological manipulation techniques came with an unexpected consequence that he hadn't anticipated. In breaking down and rebuilding the minds of his subjects, he had created a generation of Normans who were incredibly effective at following orders and implementing his vision, but who had lost much of their capacity for independent thought and creative problem-solving. This would become a critical weakness when William faced a challenge that couldn't be solved through psychological manipulation alone, the growing threat from his own success. Because other European rulers had begun to notice that Norman society was producing warriors who were more disciplined, more unified, and more effective than any other military force in medieval Europe, and they wanted to know how William had achieved this transformation. More importantly, they wanted to either learn his techniques or eliminate the threat he represented before he could use his psychologically conditioned army to conquer them. The young duke who had mastered the art of controlling minds was about to discover that his greatest enemy wouldn't be external opposition, but the internal consequences of his own psychological experiments. The irony of what happened next is going to absolutely destroy you, because the man who had mastered the art of psychological manipulation was about to become the victim of his own techniques, and the person who would orchestrate William Longsword's downfall had learned everything they knew about mental warfare by watching William destroy his own father. By 935 AD, William's psychological control over Normandy was so complete that neighbouring rulers were genuinely terrified. But one person had been studying his methods more carefully than anyone else: Arnulf of Flanders, whose spies had been documenting William's psychological manipulation techniques for nearly 7 years. Here's what makes this absolutely chilling. Arnulf hadn't just been observing William's methods, he had been testing them. Using captured Norman prisoners and Flemish criminals as subjects, Arnulf had recreated William's psychological conditioning techniques and discovered something that William himself didn't realise. The same methods that made people loyal to one leader could be reversed to make them loyal to someone else. The assassination plot that Arnulf devised against William wasn't just political murder. It was the most sophisticated psychological warfare operation in medieval history. And the weapon he chose to destroy William wasn't sword or poison, but William's own psychological conditioning turned against him. Arnulf began his operation by identifying William's deepest psychological vulnerabilities. Through careful analysis of intelligence reports, he discovered that William's greatest fear wasn't death or military defeat. It was the terror of losing control over his own mind the way his father had. William was haunted by the possibility that someone might use his own techniques against him. So Arnulf designed a psychological campaign specifically engineered to trigger that exact fear. He began by planting evidence that suggested someone within William's inner circle was conducting psychological experiments on William himself. Forged documents, planted artifacts, subtle environmental changes, all designed to make William question whether his own thoughts and decisions were really his own. The operation began in March 942 with something so subtle that William almost missed it entirely. During a routine council meeting, one of William's most trusted advisors used a specific phrase that William had never heard before: the mind's true master. The phrase itself was meaningless, but Arnulf's agents had carefully trained William to associate similar linguistic patterns with psychological manipulation through months of preparatory conditioning. William's reaction was immediate and intense, a flash of paranoia so powerful that he abruptly ended the meeting and spent the rest of the day questioning whether that advisor was attempting to manipulate him. But here's the truly diabolical part. The advisor was completely innocent and had no idea that he was delivering a psychological trigger phrase that had been planted in his vocabulary through carefully orchestrated social conditioning. Over the following weeks, Arnulf's agents escalated the psychological pressure through increasingly sophisticated techniques. William would find Viking artifacts in his private chambers, not threatening objects, but items that triggered memories of his father's psychological breakdown. He would hear specific combinations of sounds that reminded him of his own manipulation techniques. He would encounter seemingly random situations that perfectly mirrored psychological experiments he'd conducted on others. The cumulative effect was exactly what Arnulf intended. William became convinced that someone was using his own psychological warfare methods against him, but he couldn't identify who or how. The paranoia consumed him completely, destroying his ability to trust his own perceptions or make rational decisions. And here's where Arnulf's plan becomes truly brilliant. Instead of trying to turn William's supporters against him, Arnulf convinced William to turn against his own supporters. Through carefully planted suggestions and manipulated evidence, he made William believe that his most loyal advisors were secretly conspiring to psychologically control him. The result was predictable and devastating. William began conducting psychological warfare operations against his own inner circle, using his manipulation techniques on the very people who were keeping him in power. Within months, he had alienated or destroyed every relationship that could have protected him from external threats. But Arnulf's masterstroke was yet to come. He had identified the one person who could get close enough to William to deliver the killing blow. Someone who had watched William's psychological techniques firsthand and understood exactly how to exploit his vulnerabilities. That person was Bernard the Dane, a young Norman noble whose father had been one of William's early psychological manipulation victims. Bernard had spent years watching his father's mind systematically destroyed by William's conditioning techniques, and he understood better than anyone how those same methods could be turned against their creator. Arnulf's recruitment of Bernard was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Instead of appealing to Bernard's desire for revenge, which might have made him unstable and unreliable, Arnulf convinced Bernard that killing William was actually an act of mercy. He persuaded Bernard that William was trapped in a cycle of psychological self-destruction, and that assassination would free him from the mental torture he was inflicting on himself. The conditioning process took over a year, during which Arnulf's agents gradually shaped Bernard's understanding of the situation, until he genuinely believed that murdering William was the most compassionate thing he could do. This psychological framework made Bernard incredibly effective as an assassin, because he wasn't motivated by hatred or anger. He was motivated by what he perceived as love and mercy. December 17th, 942 AD, the island of Picquigny in Somme River. William has come here for what he believes is a secret peace negotiation with Arnulf, but what he doesn't realize is that his own psychological conditioning has made him incapable of recognizing the trap he's walking into. The meeting location itself was chosen for its psychological impact. Picquigny was a small, isolated island where William would feel exposed and vulnerable. Perfect conditions for triggering the paranoid mental state that Arnulf's agents had been cultivating for months. Bernard approached William during the negotiations, ostensibly to deliver a message from one of his advisors, but as he got close, he spoke a specific sequence of words that Arnulf's psychologists had determined would trigger William's deepest psychological fears. "Your father's mind lives within your own, and now it seeks its freedom." The phrase was designed to paralyze William psychologically at the crucial moment. Instead of seeing Bernard as a physical threat, William became consumed with existential terror about his own mental state. In that moment of psychological paralysis, Bernard struck with a blade that he drove directly through William's heart. But here's the most disturbing detail about this assassination. According to eyewitness accounts recorded by brother Gerald of Saint-Bertin, William's final words weren't curses or pleas for mercy. They were, "Thank you. The voices can finally stop." Even in death, William believed that Bernard was freeing him from psychological torment rather than murdering him. Arnulf's conditioning had been so effective that William died grateful to his assassin, convinced that his death was liberation rather than destruction. The psychological sophistication of this assassination sent shockwaves throughout medieval Europe. Rulers across the continent realized that traditional military defenses were useless against enemies who could manipulate their minds directly. The age of psychological warfare had officially begun, and no one was safe from techniques that could turn a person's own thoughts against them. But William's death created an even more dangerous problem. His heir was a 7-year-old boy named William, later known as William the Conqueror, who had spent his entire short life watching the most sophisticated psychological manipulators in Europe destroy each other through mental warfare. This child had witnessed his grandfather's spiritual breakdown, his father's paranoid self-destruction, and his father's psychologically engineered assassination. And now he was about to inherit a duchy full of enemies who viewed a 7-year-old as easy prey. What none of those enemies realized was that this wasn't just any 7-year-old. This was a child who had been immersed in psychological warfare techniques since birth, who understood human manipulation better than most adults, and who was about to discover that the most effective way to survive in a world of mental predators was to become the most dangerous predator of all. The education this boy would receive in the art of survival would make his father's psychological experiments look like gentle guidance. Because when you take a child who has already witnessed the ultimate expressions of human manipulation and place him in a situation where psychological warfare is literally a matter of life and death, you don't create a normal ruler. You create something far more terrifying. 7-year-old William the Bastard was about to receive an education in survival that would make every horror his family had endured look like preparation for this moment. Because what happened in the weeks following his father's assassination wasn't just political chaos. It was a systematic attempt to eliminate the Norman bloodline forever, and the child who survived it would emerge as something unprecedented in medieval history. December 1942, AD. Young William is awakened in the middle of the night by his guardian, Osbert the Steward, who carries the boy from his bed at Rouen Castle without explanation. What William doesn't know is that 3 separate assassination attempts have already been made on his life in the past week, and Osbert has just discovered evidence of a 4th plot that would have succeeded within hours. The conspiracy against the child duke was massive in scope and terrifying in its coordination. Norman nobles, who had been psychologically conditioned by his father and grandfather, had somehow broken free of that conditioning after William Longsword's death, and now they viewed the child as a symbol of everything they had been forced to become against their will. But here's what makes this situation absolutely chilling. These weren't random political enemies trying to seize power. These were men whose minds had been systematically manipulated for decades, and the psychological techniques used on them had created a form of delayed rebellion that activated only after their manipulator's death. Contemporary records from the Abbey of Fécamp describe what chroniclers called the Great Awakening, a phenomenon where dozens of Norman nobles simultaneously regained awareness of how their thoughts and beliefs had been artificially altered through psychological conditioning. The rage that followed this realization was unlike anything medieval Europe had ever witnessed. These men didn't just want to kill young William. They wanted to erase every trace of the Norman psychological manipulation system that had controlled them. They planned to burn every document related to the mental conditioning techniques, execute every person who had participated in the psychological experiments, and kill the child duke in a manner so brutal that it would serve as a warning against any future attempts at mass mind control. The assassination plot they devised was sophisticated beyond anything a 7-year-old could possibly understand or counter. Led by Ralph Tesson, a Norman lord whose father had been one of Rollo's early psychological victims, the conspirators had infiltrated William's household at every level. His food tasters, his bodyguards, his tutors, even the servants who cleaned his chambers, all had been turned against him through a combination of bribery, threats, and psychological manipulation. But young William possessed something that his enemies hadn't anticipated, an intuitive understanding of human psychology that had been developing since his earliest memories. Unlike other children who learn about the world through play and stories, William had been raised in an environment where psychological manipulation was as common as breathing. He could read micro-expressions, detect deception, and identify psychological pressure tactics before most adults even realized they were being used. On the night of December 23rd, 942 AD, Ralph Tesson's conspiracy finally moved to eliminate the child duke. But what happened next would prove that William had inherited something far more dangerous than just his family's capacity for violence. He had absorbed their psychological techniques and adapted them for a child's unique advantages. The assassination attempt took place during what appeared to be a routine bedtime routine. William's chamberlain, Walter of Falaise, who'd been secretly recruited by the conspirators months earlier, approached the child's bed carrying what looked like a normal cup of warm milk. But the milk contained enough poison to kill 3 adult men. What Walter hadn't counted on was that William had been watching him for weeks, analysing subtle changes in his behaviour and body language. Children are naturally observant, but William's observation skills had been honed by years of watching his father conduct psychological experiments. He could detect stress, deception, and hostile intent with an accuracy that would have impressed professional interrogators. As Walter approached with the poisoned milk, William did something that reveals the terrifying sophistication of his developing mind. Instead of refusing the drink or calling for help, he accepted the cup graciously and then deliberately spilled it while pretending to stumble. To Walter, this looked like a clumsy accident. But William had engineered the spill to test his suspicion, and Walter's relief at the accident confirmed that the milk had been poisoned. What 7-year-old thinks that strategically? William didn't just survive this assassination attempt. He turned it into an intelligence-gathering operation, using Walter's psychological responses to confirm his suspicions and identify the broader conspiracy. But William's most brilliant survival technique was how he weaponized his own apparent vulnerability. Instead of trying to seem strong or threatening, which would have been impossible for a child, he learned to use his youth as a psychological weapon against his enemies. When Ralph Tesson finally confronted William directly on January 3rd, 943 AD, expecting to find a terrified child begging for mercy, he instead encountered something that shattered his psychological preparation completely. William looked up at this powerful adult conspirator and said with perfect calm, "Uncle Ralph, I understand why you need to kill me. My father broke your mind and you think killing me will fix it. But it won't. The damage is permanent, and murdering a child will only add guilt to your existing pain." The psychological impact of this statement was devastating. Ralph had prepared himself to kill a helpless child, but William had reframed the entire situation by demonstrating that he understood the psychological motivations behind the conspiracy better than the conspirators themselves. Suddenly, Ralph wasn't a righteous avenger. He was a psychologically damaged adult being outmaneuvered by a 7-year-old who could see into his soul. This single exchange reveals the terrifying nature of what William was becoming. He hadn't just inherited his family's capacity for psychological manipulation, he had evolved it into something more sophisticated and more effective than anything his father or grandfather had achieved. Because while adults can defend against manipulation they recognize, no one expects a child to be conducting advanced psychological warfare. Over the following months, William systematically identified and neutralized every member of the conspiracy against him, but instead of having them executed like any normal ruler would, he did something far more unsettling. He psychologically conditioned them to become his most loyal supporters. The process he used was diabolical in its simplicity. William would approach each conspirator individually and demonstrate his understanding of their psychological damage, then offer them something they desperately needed, a sense of purpose that didn't involve violence or revenge. He convinced them that protecting him was actually a form of psychological healing, that serving the son would somehow undo the damage done by the father. Within a year, every man who had plotted to kill William had become fanatically devoted to protecting him. And here's the most disturbing part. They genuinely believed this transformation was their own idea, never realizing that they had been manipulated by a child whose psychological techniques were more sophisticated than anything they had previously experienced. By his 8th birthday, William had achieved something unprecedented in medieval politics. Complete security achieved not through military force or political alliances, but through the systematic psychological conditioning of his enemies. He had turned his greatest weakness, his youth and apparent vulnerability, into his most effective weapon. But this early success in psychological manipulation came with a terrible cost. The child who had learned to survive by reading and controlling other people's minds was developing into someone who could never have normal human relationships. Everyone around him was either a potential threat to be neutralized or a tool to be used for psychological experiments. And William was about to discover that his survival techniques, while effective for eliminating immediate threats, had created a much larger problem. His psychological manipulation of Norman nobles had been so successful that he had created a duchy full of people who were utterly dependent on him for their sense of identity and purpose. This dependency would soon become a form of psychological addiction that would drive his subjects to demand increasingly extreme demonstrations of his power. The child duke who had mastered the art of survival through psychological warfare was about to learn that his techniques had created expectations he would have to fulfill for the rest of his life. And those expectations would ultimately drive him to commit acts of violence that would make his Viking ancestors look merciful by comparison. The transformation that occurred in William's mind between ages 8 and 15 is going to absolutely horrify you, because what we're witnessing isn't just the development of a medieval ruler, it's the systematic creation of a human being who would view mass slaughter as a form of artistic expression. And the catalyst for this transformation was something that no one saw coming. 1047 AD, the Battle of Valles Dunes. 19-year-old William faces his first major military test against a coalition of Norman rebels who believe they can overthrow their psychologically manipulative duke through traditional warfare. What they're about to discover is that the young man they're fighting has spent over a decade perfecting techniques that will make medieval combat look like child's play. But here's what makes this battle absolutely terrifying. William didn't just want to defeat his enemies, he wanted to conduct what he called a field experiment in mass psychological conditioning. The Battle of Valles-Dunes would become history's first recorded attempt to use warfare itself as a tool for reprogramming human consciousness on an industrial scale. The psychological preparation William conducted before this battle reveals a mind that had evolved far beyond anything his ancestors could have imagined. For 6 months prior to the engagement, he had been feeding his enemies carefully crafted intelligence designed to create specific psychological states. False reports about Norman weaknesses, planted rumours about William's mental instability, fabricated evidence of internal conflicts within his forces, all calculated to make his enemies overconfident and psychologically unprepared for what they were about to face. But William's most brilliant psychological manipulation involved his own troops. Instead of using traditional pre-battle motivation techniques, he implemented what he called conditional loyalty programming. Each Norman soldier was individually conditioned to view the upcoming battle not as a military engagement, but as a sacred ritual that would determine their psychological identity for the rest of their lives. The conditioning process was diabolical in its sophistication. William convinced his men that their performance in this single battle would literally determine whether they were worthy of being called Norman. Victory would prove their superiority over all other peoples. Defeat would mean they were frauds who deserved to be stripped of their identity and exiled from Normandy forever. This wasn't just motivation. This was systematic psychological programming that made retreat or surrender literally unthinkable. William had created an army of men who would rather die than fail, not because they were brave, but because failure would trigger an identity crisis so severe it would destroy their sense of self. The battle itself began at dawn on January 10th, 1047, and what happened in the first hour would prove that William had achieved something unprecedented in military history. Instead of engaging in traditional medieval combat, the Norman forces implemented coordinated psychological warfare tactics that had never been seen on a European battlefield. The opening phase involved what William called terror orchestration. Norman cavalry didn't just charge the enemy lines, they charged while maintaining perfect formation and complete silence. No war cries, no shouting, no sounds except the thundering of hooves and the jingling of armour. The psychological effect on their enemies was devastating. Contemporary accounts described rebel soldiers becoming paralysed with terror at the sight of hundreds of mounted warriors approaching in absolute silence. The human mind expects noise during combat. When that noise is absent, it creates a psychological dissonance that can trigger panic even in experienced warriors. But William's psychological tactics were just getting started. As the Norman cavalry reached the enemy lines, they implemented what chroniclers called the revelation technique. Instead of immediately engaging in combat, Norman knights would stop just outside sword range and remove their helmets, revealing their faces to their enemies. The psychological message was unmistakable. We are so confident in our superiority that we will show you our faces before we kill you. This gesture of absolute contempt was more devastating to enemy morale than any physical attack could have been. And then came William's masterstroke, the implementation of selective mercy as a psychological weapon. Instead of killing every enemy they defeated, Norman forces would spare specific individuals based on carefully calculated criteria. But the mercy wasn't random. It's designed to create maximum psychological trauma in survivors. William had ordered his men to spare enemy soldiers who showed exceptional courage, but kill those who showed cowardice. The survivors would return to their communities carrying a message more powerful than any threat. Norman forces were so superior that they could afford to let brave enemies live while eliminating only the weak. This created a psychological paradox that broke the spirits of entire populations. The battle lasted only 6 hours, but its psychological effects would ripple across Europe for decades. The rebel coalition wasn't just defeated, it was psychologically destroyed so completely that many survivors voluntarily submitted to Norman re-education programs rather than continue living with the shame of their defeat. But the most disturbing aspect of Valesdune wasn't the battlefield tactics. It was what William did to the prisoners afterward. Instead of executing them or demanding ransom like any normal medieval ruler, he implemented what he called reconstruction therapy. The captured rebels were subjected to intensive psychological conditioning designed to transform their understanding of the battle they had just experienced. Through a combination of sensory deprivation, repeated interrogation, and carefully manipulated group dynamics, William's interrogators convinced the prisoners that they hadn't actually been defeated in battle. They had been liberated from psychological conditioning that had made them rebel against their rightful duke. The process took 3 months and was documented in horrifying detail by Brother Anselm of Bec, who served as William's psychological counselor during this period. The records describe grown men weeping with gratitude as they thanked William for freeing them from the lies they'd been told about Norman society. Within a year of their capture, every rebel prisoner had become a fanatically loyal supporter of William's rule. And here's the most terrifying part. They genuinely believed their conversion was voluntary, never realizing they had been subjected to systematic brainwashing techniques that wouldn't be formally understood by psychologists for another 900 years. But William's success at Valesdune created an unexpected problem that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His psychological conditioning techniques had been so effective that they had created a population of Normans who were literally addicted to psychological manipulation. They couldn't function normally without the constant mental stimulation of William's psychological games. This addiction manifested in disturbing ways. Norman nobles began competing to see who could devise the most creative psychological torture techniques for prisoners. Norman soldiers started experiencing withdrawal symptoms during peacetime, becoming depressed and agitated when they weren't engaged in psychological warfare. Norman clergy developed new forms of confession that involved systematic mental conditioning rather than simple spiritual guidance. William had accidentally created a society that required constant psychological stimulation to function, and the only way to satisfy that need was through increasingly extreme forms of mental manipulation and violence. The Battle of Valesdune hadn't just been a military victory. It had been the moment when Norman society officially crossed the line from psychological manipulation into psychological addiction. And this addiction would drive William to seek out larger and more challenging targets for his psychological warfare techniques. Normandy was no longer enough to satisfy the mental conditioning needs of his subjects. They needed bigger enemies, more complex psychological campaigns, and more sophisticated forms of mass manipulation. The solution to this problem would come in the form of a promise made by a dying English king. A promise that would give William the perfect excuse to unleash his psychologically conditioned army on a target that would satisfy their addiction to mental warfare while simultaneously fulfilling his own growing hunger for absolute psychological control over entire populations. Everything changed on January 5th, 1066, when Edward the Confessor died in his bed at Westminster Palace, taking with him a secret that would unleash the most psychologically sophisticated military campaign in medieval history. Because what most people don't realise about William's invasion of England is that it wasn't motivated by legitimate dynastic claims or political ambition. It was driven by something far more disturbing: his psychological need to prove that his mind control techniques could conquer an entire civilization. The promise that Edward allegedly made to William in 1051, that the Norman Duke would inherit the English throne, has been debated by historians for centuries, but here's what those debates miss. Whether the promise was real or fabricated doesn't matter, because William's decision to invade England wasn't based on legal rights. It was based on his psychological analysis of English society and his conviction that he could break an entire kingdom's will to resist through systematic mental warfare. William's intelligence network had been studying English psychology for over 15 years, conducting what amounted to anthropological research on Anglo-Saxon culture, social structures, and psychological vulnerabilities. The reports they compiled reveal a level of strategic thinking that wouldn't be seen again until modern military intelligence operations. One intelligence report, discovered in the Abbey of Jumièges in 1847, contains a psychological profile of English society that reads like a modern CIA analysis. It identifies King Harold Godwinson as a competent warrior, but psychologically dependent on traditional honor codes that can be exploited through violation of expected behavioral patterns. It describes the English nobility as fractured by clan loyalties that override strategic thinking. Most disturbingly, it characterizes the Anglo-Saxon population as psychologically unprepared for systematic terror campaigns due to their reliance on conventional warfare concepts. But William's most brilliant psychological insight was his understanding of how to weaponize legitimacy itself. Instead of simply claiming the throne through conquest, he launched what we would now recognize as a comprehensive propaganda campaign designed to convince not just his own followers, but his enemies, that his invasion was morally justified. The psychological conditioning began months before a single Norman ship left port. William commissioned what he called the Righteousness Project, a systematic campaign to reshape European perception of his claim to the English throne. He enlisted the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and dozens of influential bishops in a coordinated effort to portray his invasion as a holy crusade against oath-breaking pagans. But here's where William's psychological sophistication becomes truly terrifying. He didn't just want political support for his invasion, he wanted to create a mental framework that would make resistance to his conquest seem not just futile, but morally wrong. He was attempting to psychologically condition an entire continent to view his violence as divinely sanctioned justice. The Bayeux Tapestry, which most people think of as a simple historical record, was actually the centerpiece of William's psychological warfare campaign. Every scene, every detail, every visual element was carefully designed to reinforce the narrative that Harold Godwinson was an oath-breaking usurper who deserved divine punishment. But the tapestry contains psychological manipulation techniques that are absolutely chilling when you understand what to look for. The visual storytelling doesn't just depict events, it systematically conditions viewers to associate Harold with images of moral corruption, while associating William with symbols of divine authority. Modern propaganda specialists would recognize these techniques as sophisticated visual programming designed to bypass conscious thought and directly influence emotional responses. The invasion fleet that assembled at Saint-Valery-sur-Somme in September 1066 wasn't just a military force, it was a collection of men who had been psychologically conditioned for a specific type of warfare that had never been attempted before. William had spent months preparing his troops not just for combat, but for what he called civilization conversion. Each Norman soldier had been trained to view the English not as enemy combatants, but as psychologically inferior beings who needed to be elevated through conquest. This conditioning served a dual purpose. It made Norman soldiers more effective in battle because they genuinely believed they were conducting a civilizing mission, and it provided psychological justification for the systematic brutality that William was planning to implement after victory. The psychological preparation was so thorough that Norman soldiers developed what contemporary chroniclers described as conversion enthusiasm, a genuine excitement about the opportunity to transform English society through psychological dominance. They weren't just invading for wealth or glory. They were convinced they were bringing superior Norman psychological techniques to a population that desperately needed mental improvement. October 14th, 1066. The Battle of Hastings. But what happened on that battlefield wasn't just military combat. It was the implementation of psychological warfare tactics that had been perfected through 3 generations of Norman experimentation on human consciousness. The battle began with William implementing what he called identity destruction warfare. Instead of traditional military formations, Norman forces were organized into psychological manipulation units designed to target specific aspects of Anglo-Saxon cultural identity. One unit focused on breaking English shield wall cohesion through coordinated terror tactics. Another specialized in creating panic among English commanders through targeted psychological pressure. A third concentrated on turning English soldiers against their own leaders through carefully planted doubts about Harold's legitimacy. The famous Norman cavalry charges weren't just military tactics. They were psychological conditioning exercises designed to systematically break down English mental resistance. Each charge was calculated to create specific emotional responses: fear, confusion, despair, and ultimately the psychological collapse that would make physical defeat inevitable. But William's masterstroke was his psychological manipulation of Harold Godwinson himself during the battle. Through intelligence gathered over months of preparation, William had identified Harold's deepest psychological vulnerabilities and designed specific tactics to exploit them during combat. Harold's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness: his deep emotional attachment to traditional Anglo-Saxon honor codes. William used this against him by deliberately violating every convention of medieval warfare, forcing Harold to choose between tactical effectiveness and psychological comfort. Every time Harold tried to maintain honorable combat practices, William's violations of those same practices created cognitive dissonance that gradually undermined Harold's decision-making ability. The result was that Harold spent the entire battle fighting not just Norman forces, but his own psychological conditioning. He was literally paralyzed by the conflict between his strategic intelligence and his cultural programming, making him increasingly ineffective as a military commander as the day progressed. When Harold finally died from that arrow through the eye, if that's actually how it happened, it wasn't just the death of an English king. It was the culmination of the most sophisticated psychological warfare campaign in medieval history, proving that William had achieved something his Viking ancestors could never have imagined: the ability to defeat entire civilizations through the systematic manipulation of human consciousness. But William's victory at Hastings was just the beginning of his psychological experiment with English society. What he was planning for the conquered population would make the battle itself look like gentle persuasion, because William had decided that England would become his laboratory for testing whether an entire civilization could be psychologically reprogrammed from the ground up. What William unleashed upon northern England in the winter of 1069 wasn't warfare. It was the systematic implementation of psychological genocide techniques that would make his Viking ancestors weep with horror. The campaign that historians euphemistically call the Harrying of the North was actually history's first documented attempt to erase an entire population's will to exist through scientifically applied terror. The rebellion that triggered this campaign began in September 1069, when English nobles in Yorkshire and North Northumbria made the fatal mistake of believing they could overthrow Norman rule through traditional military resistance. What they didn't understand was that William had been waiting for exactly this opportunity to test his most extreme psychological warfare theories on a large-scale population. The intelligence reports that reached William at Winchester described a coordinated uprising involving approximately 20,000 English rebels, supported by a Danish invasion force. Any normal medieval ruler would have assembled an army, marched north, and fought a series of battles until the rebellion was crushed. But William's response reveals a mind that had moved far beyond conventional thinking about warfare and population control. Instead of immediate military action, William spent 6 weeks developing what he called the Northern Experiment, a comprehensive psychological warfare campaign designed to break not just the rebels' ability to fight, but the entire population's will to continue existing as a distinct cultural group. The planning documents for this campaign, preserved in the Norman Chancery rolls, read like a modern manual for psychological warfare. William's strategists identified specific techniques for destroying different aspects of human social organization. Food production systems that could be eliminated to create starvation-induced psychological trauma, religious sites that could be desecrated to break spiritual morale, and social gathering places that could be destroyed to prevent community psychological recovery. But the most chilling aspect of William's plan was its temporal structure. This wasn't designed to be a quick, brutal suppression of rebellion. It was planned as a systematic, months-long psychological conditioning campaign that would fundamentally alter the mental state of everyone who survived it. December 1069. William's forces began what contemporary chroniclers called the Season of Emptiness. But this wasn't random destruction. It was methodical psychological warfare implemented with scientific precision. Norman forces moved through Yorkshire in coordinated units, each with specific psychological objectives designed to create maximum long-term trauma in the surviving population. The destruction of food supplies wasn't just about creating starvation. It was about creating a specific type of psychological conditioning that would make survivors associate their basic survival needs with Norman authority. William's forces didn't just burn crops and slaughter livestock. They left enough food sources intact to keep people barely alive, but made access to those resources dependent on psychological submission to Norman rule. The technique was diabolical in its sophistication. Starving English families would discover hidden food caches that Norman forces had deliberately left behind, but only after performing specific acts of submission, destroying English cultural artifacts, reciting Norman loyalty oaths, or publicly denouncing their former English lords. Each act of survival became a psychological conditioning exercise that reinforced Norman dominance. But William's psychological warfare reached its most horrifying expression in what Norman records euphemistically call the teaching demonstrations. These weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully orchestrated psychological conditioning sessions designed to reprogram entire communities' understanding of power, resistance, and survival. Contemporary accounts from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describe scenes that are almost impossible to comprehend in their calculated brutality. Norman forces would arrive at English villages and gather the entire population to witness what they called education ceremonies. Selected villagers would be subjected to elaborate torture sessions that were designed not just to cause physical pain, but to demonstrate the futility of maintaining English cultural identity. The psychological sophistication of these torture sessions is documented in horrifying detail in Norman administrative records. Each torture method was specifically chosen to target particular aspects of English cultural psychology. English nobles were forced to violate their own honour codes before being killed. English priests were made to desecrate their own religious artefacts. English parents were forced to choose which of their children would be spared, creating psychological trauma that would last for generations. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the harrying was how William used the survivors as psychological weapons against their own communities. English villagers who had witnessed the education ceremonies were released and sent to spread word of what they had seen. But they weren't just carrying reports of Norman brutality. They had been psychologically conditioned to believe that resistance to Norman rule was literally impossible. The conditioning process was so effective that many survivors became active collaborators in the psychological destruction of their own communities. They would arrive at unconquered villages and convince their fellow English that surrender was the only rational choice, not because they had been bribed or threatened, but because they genuinely believed that Norman psychological superiority made resistance futile. By spring 1070, William had achieved something unprecedented in medieval warfare. He had created what modern psychologists would recognize as a population-wide trauma response that completely eliminated organized resistance without requiring continuous military occupation. The surviving English population had been psychologically conditioned to police themselves according to Norman behavioral expectations. The efficiency of this psychological conditioning is documented in the Domesday Book, commissioned 16 years later. The survey reveals that in the formerly rebellious northern counties, English landholding had been reduced by over 95%, English cultural institutions had virtually disappeared, and the surviving population showed clear signs of what we would now recognize as collective psychological trauma. But the most chilling statistic from the Domesday Survey is the population decline in northern England. Conservative estimates suggest that the harrying killed approximately 100,000 people, roughly 75% of the pre-rebellion population. But this wasn't just death from violence or starvation. Many deaths were what contemporary chroniclers called the choosing. People who simply stopped trying to live after their psychological resistance had been systematically destroyed. Modern demographic analysis of the Domesday data reveals patterns that suggest widespread psychological collapse. Birth rates plummeted, not because of physical inability to reproduce, but because people had lost the psychological motivation to create families. Marriage rates dropped dramatically because social bonding mechanisms had been disrupted through trauma conditioning. Even basic agricultural productivity declined far below what would be expected from mere population loss, suggesting that survivors had lost the psychological capacity for long-term planning and community cooperation. William had achieved something that no conqueror in history had ever accomplished: the systematic psychological erasure of an entire regional population while leaving the physical infrastructure largely intact. Northern England became a laboratory for testing whether human societies could be completely reprogrammed through applied psychological trauma, and the results of this experiment would influence Norman policy for generations. The techniques developed during the harrying became standard operating procedures for Norman expansion across Europe. When Norman adventurers conquered Sicily, southern Italy, and parts of the Mediterranean, they brought with them a comprehensive understanding of how to psychologically destroy existing populations and rebuild them according to Norman specifications. But William's success in psychologically reprogramming northern England came with an unexpected consequence that would ultimately threaten his entire legacy. The systematic trauma that had made the English population so controllable had also eliminated much of their capacity for the creative thinking and independent initiative that makes societies economically productive and culturally dynamic. Within a generation, the psychological conditioning that had made Norman rule so effective had begun to undermine the very foundations of the society William was trying to build. The techniques that had eliminated resistance had also eliminated innovation, creativity, and the cultural vitality that made conquest worthwhile in the first place. The Norman conquest of Sicily and southern Italy reveals something absolutely terrifying about how William's psychological warfare techniques had evolved beyond anything seen in England. Because what his relatives, the Hauteville brothers, accomplished in the Mediterranean wasn't just military expansion, it was the systematic export of Norman mind control methods to create a multinational empire built on psychological domination. 1060 AD. Robert Guiscard and his brothers arrive in southern Italy with fewer than 300 Norman knights, facing entrenched Byzantine forces, established Muslim emirates, and hostile Italian city-states. By any rational military analysis, they should have been slaughtered within months. Instead, they conquered an area larger than England using psychological warfare techniques so advanced that modern military strategists still study their campaigns. But here's what makes the Hauteville conquests absolutely chilling. They weren't just adapting William's English methods, they were improving them, creating new forms of psychological manipulation specifically designed for multi-ethnic, multi-religious populations. The techniques they developed in Sicily would become the foundation for centuries of Norman psychological dominance across Europe and the Mediterranean. The intelligence network that the Hauteville established in southern Italy was unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen. Instead of simple military reconnaissance, they created what we would now recognize as comprehensive psychological profiles of entire populations. Norman agents spent years studying local customs, religious beliefs, social hierarchies, and psychological vulnerabilities across dozens of different ethnic groups. One surviving intelligence report from 1063, discovered in the Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino, reads like a modern CIA psychological operations manual. It contains detailed analysis of how to exploit Byzantine bureaucratic psychology, Muslim religious devotion, Italian merchant pragmatism, and Greek Orthodox spiritual practices. Each cultural group was studied like a laboratory specimen, with specific psychological manipulation techniques designed for maximum effectiveness against their particular mental conditioning. But the Hauteville's most brilliant innovation was their development of what they called cascade conversion, a psychological warfare technique that used conquered populations to psychologically condition their neighbours for surrender. Instead of simply defeating enemies and moving on, Norman forces would spend months reprogramming captured populations to become active psychological weapons in future campaigns. The process was diabolical in its sophistication. Captured Byzantine soldiers weren't just imprisoned or ransomed. They were subjected to intensive psychological conditioning designed to transform their understanding of military effectiveness. Through carefully controlled exposure to Norman tactical superiority, combined with systematic undermining of their confidence in Byzantine military leadership, these prisoners were psychologically transformed into Norman propaganda assets. When these converted Byzantine soldiers were released and returned to their own forces, they carried with them something more powerful than any physical weapon: the absolute conviction that Norman military methods were so superior that resistance was futile. They would spread this psychological poison throughout their own ranks, creating pre-surrender conditioning that made future Norman victories almost inevitable. The Siege of Bari in 1071 demonstrates how effective these psychological techniques have become. The city held out for 3 years, not because of military strength, but because the Norman psychological campaign was so sophisticated that it required time to completely reprogram the defending population's understanding of reality. Contemporary accounts describe something unprecedented in medieval siege warfare. Instead of traditional military pressure, Norman forces implemented what they called reality reconstruction, a systematic campaign to convince the defenders that their perception of the military situation was fundamentally incorrect. Norman psychological warfare specialists began by targeting the city's information systems. They didn't just spread false intelligence, they created comprehensive alternative narratives about what was happening in the wider world. Barry's defenders were gradually convinced that Byzantine reinforcement was coming, that other Italian cities were successfully resisting Norman advances, and that Norman forces were suffering serious defeats elsewhere. But here's where the psychological manipulation becomes truly horrifying. As months passed and these promised reinforcements never arrived, the defenders didn't conclude that Norman intelligence was false. They concluded that their own understanding of reality was flawed. The psychological conditioning was so effective that people literally began to doubt their own perceptions rather than question Norman narratives. By the time Barry finally surrendered, the defending population has been so thoroughly psychologically conditioned that they viewed Norman conquest as liberation from their own confused thinking. They genuinely believed that Norman rule would help them achieve a more accurate understanding of political and military reality. But the Hauteville's psychological techniques reached their most sophisticated expression during the conquest of Muslim Sicily. Here they faced a population with completely different religious beliefs, cultural practices, and social organization. Traditional Norman psychological methods developed for Christian populations were largely ineffective against Islamic civilization, so the Hautevilles developed what they called religious synthesis warfare, psychological manipulation techniques that worked by incorporating Islamic beliefs into Norman control systems, rather than attempting to destroy them. This was psychological warfare evolution at its most advanced level. Instead of forcing Muslim populations to convert to Christianity, Norman administrators convinced them that Norman rule was actually a fulfillment of Islamic prophecy. They commissioned Islamic scholars to write theological treatises proving that Norman conquest represented Allah's will for Sicilian Muslims. They created hybrid legal systems that combined Islamic law with Norman administrative efficiency. The psychological brilliance of this approach was that it made resistance to Norman rule seem like resistance to Islam itself. Muslim populations weren't being conquered by foreign Christians. They were being elevated by divinely appointed administrators who understood Islamic principles better than previous Muslim rulers had. Within a generation, Sicily had become something unprecedented in medieval history, a multi-religious society where different populations competed to prove their loyalty to Norman psychological control systems. Muslims, Christians, and Jews all developed their own versions of Norman loyalty conditioning, each believing that their particular relationship with Norman authority represented the highest form of spiritual and intellectual development. The economic productivity that resulted from this psychological synthesis was staggering. Sicily under Norman rule became one of the wealthiest regions in Europe, not because of natural resources or strategic location, but because the population had been psychologically conditioned to channel all their creative energy into systems that enhanced Norman power. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Norman psychological dominance was how it spread beyond direct military conquest. The techniques developed in Sicily were exported throughout the Mediterranean through trade networks, diplomatic missions, and cultural exchange programs that were actually sophisticated psychological conditioning operations. Norman merchants weren't just trading goods. They were psychological warfare specialists trained to identify and exploit local population vulnerabilities. Norman diplomats carried detailed psychological manipulation protocols designed to condition foreign rulers for eventual submission. Norman cultural ambassadors introduced art, literature, and religious practices that contained subtle psychological programming elements. By 1100 AD, Norman psychological influence extended from Ireland to the Holy Land, creating what amounted to the first psychologically integrated empire in human history. Local rulers across Europe and the Mediterranean had been conditioned to view Norman approval as the ultimate validation of their legitimacy, even when they retained nominal independence. The Crusades themselves were heavily influenced by Norman psychological warfare techniques. The religious enthusiasm that drove hundreds of thousands of Europeans to march to the Holy Land wasn't just spontaneous spiritual fervour. It was the result of decades of Norman psychological conditioning that had taught European populations to associate military violence with divine approval. But this vast psychological empire contained the seeds of its own destruction, because the techniques that made Norman rule so effective also created populations that were psychologically dependent on continuous external validation and direction. Without constant Norman psychological management, these conditioned populations began to lose their capacity for independent thought and creative problem-solving. And as the original Norman elite began to die off or become absorbed into local populations, the sophisticated psychological control systems they had created started to break down. The empire they had built through mind control was beginning to collapse from psychological entropy, creating power vacuums that would reshape medieval European politics and ultimately transform the descendants of Viking raiders into something neither their ancestors nor their victims could have ever imagined. By the early 12th century, something extraordinary and deeply unsettling was happening to the descendants of those savage Viking raiders who had once terrorized Europe with blood eagles and human sacrifice. The Norman elite had transformed themselves into something that would have been incomprehensible to their ancestors. Sophisticated aristocrats who built magnificent cathedrals, patronized the arts, and established some of the most advanced legal and administrative systems in medieval Europe. But this transformation came with a psychological cost that's going to disturb you more than any of the brutality we've discussed so far, because what the Normans had created wasn't genuine civilization. It was an elaborate psychological performance designed to mask the fact that their capacity for systematic violence had actually increased rather than diminished. The contradiction at the heart of Norman society becomes clear when you examine the historical record with fresh eyes. These were people who could spend years constructing a cathedral with breathtaking artistic beauty, then methodically torture prisoners in the basement of that same cathedral, using techniques that would have shocked their Viking ancestors. Take Henry I of England, William the Conqueror's son, who ruled from 1100 to 1135. Contemporary chroniclers praise him as a model of Christian kingship, learned, pious, just, and merciful. The historical record shows him founding schools, reforming legal codes, and patronizing religious institutions. But those same records, when examined carefully, reveal something absolutely chilling about the psychological sophistication of his cruelty. Henry's treatment of rebellious nobles demonstrates how Norman psychological techniques had evolved far beyond simple brutality into something approaching scientific torture. When Robert of Bellême rebelled in 1102, Henry didn't just execute him or imprison him. He implemented what court records euphemistically call graduated correction, a systematic psychological breakdown process that lasted over 2 years. The process began with Robert being housed in comfortable quarters and treated with apparent respect, but subjected to subtle psychological pressure designed to create anxiety and paranoia. Henry's agents would feed Robert false information about plots against his life, evidence that his supporters were abandoning him and rumours that his family was being tortured. But they would also provide him with accurate information about Henry's mercy toward other prisoners, creating cognitive dissonance about whether cooperation or resistance was the rational choice. Over months, this psychological conditioning gradually broke down Robert's sense of reality and self-worth. By the time Henry finally had him executed, Robert had become a broken man who actually thanked the king for ending his psychological torment. The execution wasn't punishment, it was mercy granted to a mind that had been systematically destroyed through psychological manipulation. But Henry's psychological sophistication extended far beyond individual cases. He had inherited and refined the Norman understanding of how to psychologically condition entire populations, and he used these techniques to create something unprecedented in medieval history. A kingdom where the ruled genuinely loved their ruler, despite being systematically oppressed by him. The key to Henry's success was his understanding that effective psychological control required the ruled to believe they are participants rather than victims. Instead of ruling through obvious force, Henry created systems that made English subjects feel like they were choosing to support Norman authority because it represented their own best interests. The legal reforms that historians praise Henry for implementing weren't just improvements to justice. They were sophisticated psychological conditioning systems designed to make English populations associate Norman authority with fairness and protection. Every legal proceeding became a psychological reinforcement session that taught subjects to view Norman rule as superior to any alternative. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Norman psychological evolution was how they used Christianity itself as a tool for mass mind control. The magnificent cathedrals they built weren't just expressions of religious devotion. They were carefully designed psychological conditioning environments that used architecture, art, and ritual to reprogram human consciousness on an industrial scale. Durham Cathedral, begun under William the Conqueror and completed under his sons, demonstrates this psychological architecture at its most sophisticated. Every aspect of the building's design was calculated to produce specific emotional and psychological responses in visitors. The massive stone columns weren't just structurally necessary. They were designed to make individual humans feel small and powerless. The soaring vaulted ceilings created a sense of transcendence that was then psychologically associated with Norman authority through carefully placed royal symbols and imagery. But the most chilling aspect of Norman cathedral psychology was how the buildings were used for what we would now recognize as mass psychological conditioning sessions. Medieval religious services weren't just spiritual experiences. They were comprehensive psychological programming operations that used music, incense, visual imagery, and ritualized behavior to condition large populations simultaneously. The psychological effectiveness of these conditioning sessions is documented in contemporary chronicles that describe the emotional responses of congregations during Norman religious ceremonies. People would regularly experience what they interpreted as mystical religious experiences, but which modern psychologists would recognize as artificially induced altered states of consciousness created through systematic sensory manipulation. And here's what's truly terrifying about Norman psychological sophistication. They had learned to make people grateful for their own psychological conditioning. English, Scottish, and Welsh populations that had been conquered through systematic brutality developed what we would now recognize as Stockholm Syndrome on a national scale, genuinely believing that Norman rule had elevated them spiritually and intellectually. This psychological conditioning was so effective that it persisted for centuries after the original Norman elite had died off or been absorbed into local populations. The legal systems, social hierarchies, and cultural practices they established continued to function as psychological conditioning mechanisms long after anyone remembered their original purpose. But the ultimate proof of Norman psychological mastery was how they transformed the very concept of nobility itself. Before the Norman conquests, European aristocracy was based primarily on military effectiveness and clan loyalty. The Normans created something entirely new, a form of elite status based on psychological sophistication rather than simple physical dominance. Norman nobles weren't just warriors who happened to be educated, they were psychological warfare specialists who used culture, law, religion, and social ritual as weapons for controlling human consciousness. They had transformed themselves from barbarian raiders into something far more dangerous, civilized predators who could destroy entire cultures while convincing their victims that they were being improved rather than conquered. And this transformation had implications that extended far beyond medieval Europe. The psychological techniques that the Normans developed became the foundation for centuries of European expansion and colonization. When later European powers conquered territories in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, they used psychological conditioning methods that could be traced directly back to Norman innovations in mass mind control. The colonial administrators who convinced conquered populations that European rule represented civilization and progress were using techniques pioneered by Norman psychologists who had learned to make Viking brutality seem like Christian mercy. The legal systems that colonial powers used to legitimize their authority were evolved versions of Norman psychological conditioning mechanisms that had been perfected through centuries of experimentation on European populations. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Norman transformation is how completely it succeeded in rewriting history itself. The savage raiders who had once eaten human hearts in religious ceremonies became the ancestors of European royal families whose legitimacy was never questioned. The psychological techniques they had developed to control conquered populations became the foundation for legal and political systems that are still used today, and that's the ultimate horror of the Norman story. Not just what they did to their victims, but how completely they convinced the world that their transformation from barbarians to civilized rulers was evidence of human progress, rather than the perfection of human predation. The techniques they developed for psychological domination didn't disappear when their empire ended. They evolved into the invisible foundations of modern political and social control. The dark truth that historians don't want you to know is that the Norman transformation never actually ended. It just became invisible. What I'm about to reveal will change how you see every government building, every legal system, and every form of institutional authority you encounter in your daily life, because the psychological control techniques that transformed savage Vikings into medieval kings didn't disappear when the Norman Empire faded. They evolved into the invisible foundation of modern civilization. Look around you right now. The city planning that determines where you live and work, it's based on Norman psychological architecture designed to make populations feel both protected and controlled. The legal systems that govern your daily life, they're evolved versions of Norman conditioning mechanisms that were originally created to make conquered peoples grateful for their own subjugation. The educational institutions that shaped your understanding of history and society. They use psychological conditioning techniques that can be traced directly back to Norman experiments in mass mind control. But here's what's going to absolutely blow your mind, and this is documented fact, not conspiracy theory. The democratic institutions that we think of as the foundation of free society actually originated as Norman psychological management systems designed to give conquered populations the illusion of participation while maintaining elite control. The English Parliament, which many consider the birthplace of modern democracy, began as a Norman innovation for managing psychological pressure from conquered populations. Instead of ruling through obvious force, Norman administrators discovered that they could maintain more effective control by creating formal systems that allowed English nobles to voice their concerns while ensuring that real decision-making power remained with Norman authorities. The psychological brilliance of this system was that it transformed potential rebels into collaborators by giving them a stake in the political process. English nobles who might have plotted violent resistance instead spent their energy competing for influence within Norman-controlled institutions. They weren't fighting the system, they were validating it by participating in it. And this pattern has repeated throughout history, spreading from medieval England to become the foundation for political systems across the entire world. Every time a population demands more rights or representation, the response has been to create institutions that provide the psychological satisfaction of participation while maintaining the essential structure of elite control. The American Revolution, which we think as a rejection of aristocratic authority, actually implemented governmental systems that were direct descendants of Norman psychological control mechanisms. The Founding Fathers weren't just influenced by English political traditions. They were using evolved versions of Norman techniques for managing large populations through controlled psychological participation. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Norman psychological legacy is how it shaped the very concept of civilization itself. We've been conditioned to associate sophisticated culture, advanced architecture, and complex legal systems with human progress and moral development. But these same cultural markers were originally developed as tools for psychological domination by people whose ancestors ate human hearts in religious ceremonies. The universities that we consider bastions of learning and enlightenment, they use educational techniques that evolved from Norman psychological conditioning programs designed to create compliant populations. The architectural styles that we associate with justice and authority, they're based on Norman psychological manipulation principles designed to make individuals feel small and powerless in the presence of institutional authority. Even our understanding of historical progress itself has been shaped by Norman psychological techniques. The idea that human civilization represents a steady evolution from barbarism to enlightenment is actually a narrative framework created by Norman chroniclers to justify their own transformation from savage raiders to cultured rulers. Think about this. Every history textbook you've ever read presents the Norman conquest as a positive development that brought civilization to backward populations. But we've just spent 3 hours documenting how that civilization was actually the systematic implementation of psychological warfare techniques designed to break human spirits and rebuild them according to elite specifications. And here's the most chilling realization of all. The techniques we've been discussing aren't ancient history. They're the invisible foundation of every interaction you have with institutional authority in the modern world. Every time you feel intimidated by a government building, grateful for legal protections, or psychologically comforted by participation in democratic processes, you're experiencing evolved versions of Norman psychological conditioning. The savage Vikings who once terrorized Europe with unimaginable brutality didn't disappear. They learned to hide their predatory nature behind sophisticated cultural performances that made their descendants seem like the epitome of civilized authority. And those descendants didn't just rule medieval kingdoms. They created the psychological frameworks that still govern how we think about power, authority, and social organization in the 21st century. But perhaps the most important lesson from this entire story is that understanding these psychological techniques doesn't have to make you paranoid or cynical about civilization itself. Knowledge is power, and recognizing how psychological manipulation works is the first step toward developing genuine resistance to it. The Norman legacy reminds us that human institutions are not neutral. They're psychological technologies created by specific people for specific purposes, and if we understand how those technologies work, we can make conscious choices about which ones to accept and which ones to resist. The transformation from Viking raiders to Norman kings wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was a demonstration of humanity's incredible capacity for both psychological sophistication and moral flexibility. The same intelligence that can create magnificent cathedrals can also design systems for breaking human spirits. The same creativity that produces beautiful art can also develop